32-year-old Crestwood diner waitress Sarah was placing the last bottle of children's fever reducer on the checkout belt when a manicured hand violently swept her groceries onto the dirty linoleum floor. The heavy glass jar of organic applesauce shattered instantly upon impact. The plastic bottle of cherry syrup spun toward the candy display, but a woman in a beige cashmere coat stepped forward and snatched it from the ground. She slammed the medicine onto the rubber belt right next to her own towering pile of imported cheeses and expensive wines. "This doesn't belong to you anymore." The voice was cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of basic human decency. Sarah stared at the disastrous mess of her meager groceries pooling around her worn canvas sneakers. She looked up, fully ready to demand a reasonable explanation, but the angry words died instantly in her dry throat. The arrogant woman standing directly in front of her was Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was the notoriously ruthless president of the board at Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy. Just 3 short days ago, Sarah's 7-year-old daughter Lily had miraculously secured the only full-ride academic scholarship to that exact elite institution. Eleanor did not even bother to cast a single glance at the growing puddle of ruined applesauce. She impatiently waved a pristine platinum credit card at the terrified teenage cashier. Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling but intensely defensive, quickly explaining that her young daughter was burning up with a severe viral fever. She desperately begged for the medicine back. Eleanor slowly turned her perfectly styled head. Her harsh eyes meticulously swept over Sarah's faded uniform. She leaned in uncomfortably close, her expensive floral perfume poorly masking the sour smell of spilled groceries. "Good mothers know exactly when to remain completely silent," Eleanor whispered, her tone completely level and dripping with venom. "If you make a public scene in this store, your daughter's scholarship will be permanently revoked at exactly 5 o'clock this afternoon due to unacceptable parental conduct." Sarah froze entirely in place. Her cold hands tightly gripped the sharp metal edge of the checkout counter. The devastating threat was absolutely not empty. Eleanor possessed the absolute unilateral power to completely ruin Lily's entire educational future with a single brief phone call. That specific bottle of medicine was the only one left in the entire snowy county due to a severe regional winter shortage. Eleanor calmly paid for the luxury items, aggressively grabbed the plastic bags, and confidently walked out the sliding glass doors without a single backward glance. Through the frosted window, Sarah helplessly watched the wealthy woman climb into a massive black Lincoln Navigator parked illegally in the designated loading zone. The teenage cashier timidly handed Sarah a thick roll of brown paper towels. The young girl apologized repeatedly, her eyes wide with genuine shock, but polite apologies could not miraculously lower a sick child's dangerous temperature. Sarah dropped heavily to her bruised knees. She silently wiped up the sticky mess with shaking, exhausted hands. She then had to painfully pay for the shattered applesauce. The rigid store manager strictly enforced the corporate breakage policy, entirely ignoring the obvious fact that another entitled customer had intentionally caused the destruction. Sarah quietly handed over her last few crumpled dollar bills. She walked out into the freezing Ohio night with absolutely nothing to show for her desperate trip. The lonely drive back to her small rented duplex was pure psychological agony. Every single red traffic light felt like a deliberate physical punishment from the universe. Inside the dimly lit apartment, little Lily was violently shivering under 3 heavy wool blankets. Her pale forehead was terrifyingly hot to the careful touch. Sarah frantically filled a cheap plastic basin with freezing tap water and crushed ice. She spent the entire agonizing night repeatedly dipping thin cotton washcloths into the freezing water and gently placing them on her daughter's flushed skin. Every weak whimper from the small twin bed twisted a jagged knife deep into Sarah's aching chest. She stayed wide awake until dawn, helplessly watching the old kitchen wall clock slowly tick away the miserable, terrifying hours. The dangerous fever finally broke just as the pale winter sun began to rise over the snowy residential rooftops. Sarah collapsed heavily into a wooden kitchen chair, utterly and completely exhausted. However, she still had to be at the local diner for the grueling early morning breakfast shift. She quickly called her elderly next-door neighbor to watch Lily, promising a week of free home-cooked meals as desperate payment. Sarah put on her freshly ironed uniform apron and walked the 2 freezing miles to the busy diner. The physical exhaustion was completely overwhelming, but the dark, simmering anger kept her legs moving steadily forward. The chaotic morning rush was exceptionally brutal. Sarah poured endless heavy pots of scalding black coffee and carried towering plates of greasy eggs and burnt bacon. Around noon, the brass bell above the heavy wooden door chimed loudly. A loud group of wealthy local women arrogantly walked in, immediately demanding the largest corner booth right by the bright window. At the absolute center of the privileged group sat Eleanor Vance. She was laughing obnoxiously loudly, wearing a completely different designer winter coat, and acting completely oblivious to the desperate waitress she had ruthlessly humiliated just the night before. Sarah kept her tired head down. She professionally took their complicated orders in total silence, clenching her sore jaws so hard her back teeth physically ached. The entitled women ordered expensive custom salads and imported sparkling water. As Sarah slowly approached the large table with their heavy drink tray, she clearly heard Eleanor speaking. The arrogant woman's shrill voice easily carried over the loud clatter of metal silverware. Eleanor was loudly complaining about her highly stressful morning routine. She sighed dramatically and casually placed a terribly familiar object right in the middle of the polished wooden table. It was the exact same bottle of children's fever reducer from the local grocery store. The protective plastic safety seal was completely broken and torn away. Eleanor dramatically rolled her dark eyes and carelessly gestured toward the sticky bottle with a perfectly manicured finger. She loudly complained to her sympathetic friends that her expensive purebred poodle had developed a very slight cough during the cold night. She had aggressively bought the medicine just in case the fragile dog desperately needed it. But the stupid dog absolutely hated the cheap cherry flavor. Eleanor laughed loudly, tossing her perfectly styled hair back over her shoulder. He spat it all over my newly imported Persian rugs. I had to dump the rest straight down the kitchen sink this morning. Such a complete and utter waste of my incredibly precious time. The other wealthy women giggled softly, delicately sipping their iced lemon water. Sarah stopped completely dead in her tracks. The heavy metal serving tray trembled violently in her scarred hands. Eleanor had intentionally taken the very last bottle of crucial medicine. She had ruthlessly threatened an innocent child's fragile educational future. She had cruelly forced a desperate mother to stay up all night fighting a truly dangerous fever with absolutely nothing but frozen tap water. And she had callously done it all for a spoiled dog who did not even swallow the pink syrup. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement was physically suffocating. The deliberate cruelty was absolutely not an unfortunate accident. It was an entertaining recreational sport for the rich. Sarah stared blankly at the completely empty plastic bottle sitting carelessly next to a white plate of untouched gourmet croutons. The paralyzing fear that had completely controlled her the night before suddenly evaporated into thin air. It was instantly replaced by a cold, sharp, and terrifyingly permanent clarity. Eleanor Vance firmly believed she was completely untouchable in this small town. She genuinely believed she could easily crush poor people like insignificant insects simply because she had endless money and a fancy title on a local school board. The rich woman aggressively flagged Sarah down, snapping her jeweled fingers impatiently in the air. Eleanor loudly demanded a fresh slice of organic lemon, completely failing to even recognize the desperate waitress she had ruthlessly threatened just 14 short hours earlier. Sarah smiled softly. It was a terrifying, completely hollow smile. She nodded slowly, turned around smoothly, and walked straight back toward the loud kitchen. The prestigious scholarship was absolutely no longer a protective shield. It was the exact destructive weapon Sarah was going to permanently use to burn Eleanor's perfect, privileged life straight to the absolute ground. Sarah walked back to the loud corner table carrying a small ceramic dish of lemon slices. She placed it down gently, carefully avoiding the empty medicine bottle that mocked her from the center of the polished wood. Eleanor did not even bother to look up from her glowing smartphone screen. The wealthy woman simply waved her hand dismissively, continuing her loud complaint about the terrible inconvenience of managing the Academy's annual charity gala. The sheer arrogance radiating from the woman was suffocating, filling the diner with a toxic atmosphere. The diner was usually a place where Sarah simply tuned out the background noise to survive her grueling shift. Today, every single word spoken at that corner booth became incredibly important. She slowly wiped down the adjacent empty tables, lingering in the narrow aisle just long enough to hear the privileged women discussing the upcoming school board audit. Eleanor was laughing coldly about how easily the financial numbers could be rearranged before the strict state inspectors arrived from the capital city. The scholarship fund is a complete lifesaver for my personal taxes, Eleanor bragged loudly to her vigorously nodding friends. She aggressively squeezed the fresh lemon into her sparkling water, entirely unaware that the quiet waitress nearby was burning every syllable into her memory. We simply admit charity cases like that little nobody from the trailer park, and suddenly the board has completely unrestricted access to the wealthy donor endowment. I just used the massive surplus to remodel my summer house kitchen with imported marble. Sarah gripped the damp cleaning rag so tightly her knuckles turned entirely white under the harsh diner lights. Her brilliant daughter's hard-earned educational opportunity was nothing but a convenient financial shield for a corrupt millionaire. Little Lily had studied for endless hours at the tiny kitchen table, desperately trying to build a better future, while this arrogant woman treated her like a disposable tax deduction. The devastating injustice of the situation tasted like bitter ash in Sarah's dry mouth. Eleanor carelessly tossed her expensive leather designer bag onto the empty vinyl chair right next to her. The heavy bag tipped over slightly, spilling a disorganized mess of golden makeup compacts, luxury car keys, and several folded pieces of official academy paperwork onto the red booth seat. The wealthy woman was far too busy arguing with her friends about an upcoming private ski trip to notice the highly sensitive financial document slipping dangerously close to the smooth edge of the wooden table. A loud, shattering crash from the kitchen suddenly distracted the crowded dining room. A young, inexperienced busboy had dropped a massive metal tray full of heavy ceramic coffee mugs and dirty glass plates. Eleanor and her wealthy friends immediately turned their styled heads toward the chaotic noise, loudly expressing their extreme annoyance at the sudden disruption. For a few brief seconds, nobody in the entire restaurant was paying any attention to the corner booth or the scattered white papers. This was the exact moment Sarah had to make a completely irreversible decision. She knew that stealing private property was fundamentally wrong, a desperate act that could instantly send her to a federal prison and leave fragile Lily entirely alone in the broken foster system. But playing by the legal rules had only resulted in her sick child being ruthlessly denied essential medicine by a cruel thief in a cashmere coat. The system was never going to naturally punish a powerful woman like Eleanor Vance. Sarah moved with terrifying speed and total, deadly silence. She smoothly stepped right up to the messy table under the direct guise of quickly refilling their tall ice water glasses. With one swift, practiced motion, her left hand dropped a clean white cloth napkin directly over a thick, folded document bearing the official Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy golden seal. As she pulled her hand back away from the table, she seamlessly dragged the hidden document into the deep front pocket of her faded cotton work apron. Her racing heart hammered violently against her sore ribs, strongly threatening to crack her chest open. She quickly stepped back into the dark shadows just as Eleanor turned back around, entirely oblivious to the missing confidential paperwork. The wealthy woman aggressively signaled for the expensive final bill, complaining that the chaotic diner environment was giving her a terrible migraine. She blindly scooped her remaining scattered items back into the leather bag without giving them a second glance. Sarah retreated safely to the steaming kitchen. She quietly hid in the narrow back supply closet among the heavy industrial mops and strong chemical cleaners. Her trembling hands carefully unfolded the stolen academy document under the flickering fluorescent light bulb. It was not just a simple financial spreadsheet. It was a highly detailed, extremely private ledger directly connecting the charity scholarship endowment fund straight to a hidden offshore shell company registered legally in Eleanor's maiden name. The undeniable, devastating proof of massive financial fraud was right there in plain black ink. Eleanor was stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from the exact academic fund specifically designed to help poor, struggling children. Sarah stared blankly at the undeniable printed numbers, slowly realizing the massive scale of the dark secret she now fully possessed. This was no longer just about a stolen bottle of pink cherry medicine. This was enough hard federal evidence to completely destroy Eleanor's entire prestigious legacy forever. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door of the narrow supply closet swung open, hitting the concrete wall with a loud bang. Sarah gasped sharply, desperately trying to quickly shove the stolen financial ledger deep back into her apron pocket. The angry diner manager stood directly in the narrow doorway, his round face red with intense fury. He was staring directly at her shaking hands, entirely blocking her only single path of physical escape. The heavy wooden door of the narrow supply closet slammed against the concrete wall, sending a terrifying echo through the cramped space. Gary Henderson, the notoriously cruel diner manager, stood blocking the only exit with his thick arms crossed over his greasy chest. His small, dark eyes immediately locked onto the thick stack of folded papers Sarah was desperately trying to shove deep into her apron pocket. The harsh, flickering fluorescent bulb overhead illuminated the dark suspicion twisting his sweaty, red face. He aggressively demanded to know exactly what his lowest-paid waitress was hiding while on company time. Sarah took a slow, deliberate step backward until her spine hit the cold metal shelving unit. Her racing heart was pounding frantically against her ribs, but her mind remained terrifyingly clear. Gary lunged forward without a single warning, his heavy hand tightly gripping her fragile wrist. He violently yanked the stolen documents out of her trembling fingers. He roughly unfolded the crisp white pages, his eyes quickly scanning the golden Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy seal and the highly confidential financial figures printed clearly below it. A cruel, greedy smile slowly spread across his face as he instantly recognized Eleanor Vance's prominent name at the very top of the private ledger. Gary laughed darkly, maliciously tapping the thick paper with his dirty fingernail. He loudly declared that the wealthy school board president would absolutely pay a massive cash reward to whoever safely returned her stolen private property. He aggressively reached for the heavy black landline phone mounted on the dirty wall, eagerly threatening to call the local police department and have Sarah immediately arrested for grand larceny. The terrifying threat of a long federal prison sentence hung heavily in the suffocating air, threatening to leave little Lily completely abandoned in the broken foster care system. This was the exact moment Sarah permanently crossed a dangerous, irreversible moral line. The old, terrified waitress would have dropped to her bruised knees and desperately begged for basic mercy. But the new, deeply hardened mother simply stared at her corrupt boss with eyes as cold as dead winter ice. She forcefully slapped his reaching hand away from the plastic phone receiver. The sudden, aggressive physical defiance completely shocked the arrogant manager, freezing him firmly. "Touch that phone, and the Internal Revenue Service gets your second set of accounting books," Sarah whispered, her voice completely stripped of any human warmth. "I know exactly how much cash you secretly skim from the register every single Friday night before you make the weekly deposit at Bank of America." Gary's smug, red face instantly drained of all color, turning a sickly, pale shade of gray. His cruel eyes darted nervously around the empty supply closet. He knew she was absolutely right. For 3 long years, Sarah had quietly cleaned his messy back office, silently observing his illegal tax evasion scheme without ever speaking a single word of complaint. She coldly took a step forward, firmly snatching the stolen academy ledger right back from his suddenly weak, trembling hands. She calmly untied her stained work apron, let it drop heavily to the dirty floor, and walked straight past him without looking back. She aggressively pushed through the heavy glass doors of the busy diner, stepping out into the freezing Ohio afternoon. She had just permanently destroyed her only reliable source of income, actively blackmailed her corrupt employer, and officially became a wanted criminal. Yet, as the bitter winter wind whipped aggressively against her cold face, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of ultimate power she had never experienced in her entire difficult life. She pulled her thin wool coat tightly around her shivering shoulders and marched purposefully down the icy sidewalk toward the busy commercial district. 10 freezing minutes later, Sarah quietly slipped inside the brightly lit local FedEx office print center. The warm, dry air smelled strongly of hot ink and industrial paper. She quickly walked over to the secluded self-service machines in the far back corner. Her frozen fingers rapidly fed the stolen financial ledger through the glowing glass scanner. The heavy machine rhythmically hummed and clicked, producing 5 perfectly crisp identical copies of Eleanor's devastating offshore banking secrets. Sarah carefully folded the fresh copies, sliding the undeniable proof of federal fraud deep into her heavy winter boots for absolute maximum security. Her next critical stop was a rundown convenience store located on the rougher side of the snowy town. She quietly approached the bulletproof glass counter and used her last remaining cash tips to purchase a cheap, untraceable prepaid mobile phone. She did not bother to buy any extra minutes. She only needed exactly enough credit to send a few strategically devastating text messages. The bored cashier barely even glanced at her as he slid the small plastic box across the scratched counter. Sarah finally returned to her dark, quiet duplex just as the pale winter sun began to rapidly set. The small apartment was freezing, but little Lily was sleeping incredibly peacefully under her heavy wool blankets, her dangerous fever completely gone. Sarah stood silently in the narrow doorway, watching her beautiful daughter's chest rise and fall with slow, steady breaths. The overwhelming surge of fierce, protective maternal love completely washed away any lingering guilt over her shocking criminal actions at the diner. Eleanor Vance had cruelly tried to destroy this innocent child, and now Eleanor was going to slowly lose absolutely everything she loved. Sitting alone at the scratched kitchen table, Sarah carefully opened the stolen ledger and found Eleanor's private, unlisted cell phone number printed neatly under the emergency contact section. She slowly powered on the cheap prepaid phone, the bright blue screen illuminating her cold, determined face in the dark kitchen. She deliberately typed out one single, terrifyingly vague sentence. She wanted the wealthy woman to feel the exact same suffocating, paralyzing panic she had felt standing in that humiliating grocery store line. Sarah stared at the glowing digital screen for one long, silent moment. She took a deep, steadying breath, firmly pressed the send button, and smoothly dropped the burner phone onto the wooden table. The first anonymous strike was officially launched. The sudden, aggressive vibration of the sleek designer smartphone completely shattered the elegant, sophisticated atmosphere of the exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club ballroom. Eleanor Vance was casually sipping a perfectly chilled glass of imported French champagne, loudly boasting to the wealthy local mayor about the highly successful charity auction. She wore a stunning, custom-made crimson silk gown that easily cost more than most working-class families in the snowy Ohio town earned in an entire year. The heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone caught the bright light of the massive crystal chandeliers above. When her phone buzzed a second time against the crisp white linen tablecloth, she impatiently glanced down, fully expecting another annoying, panic-stricken update from her exhausted personal assistant regarding the expensive floral arrangements. Instead, the glowing digital screen displayed a completely unknown, untraceable number. The short text message contained only a single, terrifyingly precise sentence. The hidden Cayman Islands shell company registered under your maiden name is no longer a secret. Eleanor instantly felt an icy, paralyzing spike of pure terror pierce straight through her tight chest. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped dangerously in her suddenly trembling fingers, spilling a few cold drops onto the polished wooden table. She frantically grabbed her heavy, imported leather handbag from the empty velvet chair beside her, desperately digging past her diamond-encrusted Rolex watch and heavy gold makeup compacts. Her manicured hands ruthlessly tore through the meticulously organized interior compartments. The thick, folded financial ledger was completely gone. Her perfectly powdered face instantly drained of all vibrant color, turning a sickly, translucent shade of chalky white under the bright, festive lights. Whoever had stolen those devastatingly incriminating documents from the crowded diner earlier that afternoon now held the absolute, terrifying power to send her directly to a federal penitentiary. The heavy, suffocating weight of total, inescapable panic violently crushed her lungs. She desperately struggled to pull in a single full breath of the expensive, perfume-scented air. The cheap burner phone sitting miles away buzzed a third time, sending another message to the terrified millionaire. Eleanor violently flinched as if the small device had physically burned her cold skin. She hastily unlocked the bright screen with a violently shaking thumb. "I am watching the Academy's official Instagram live stream right now," the anonymous text message ordered with cold, calculated precision. "If you want to keep the federal agents away from your massive winter estate, you will follow my exact instructions immediately." Eleanor swallowed hard, her mouth tasting completely dry and metallic. She was scheduled to deliver the highly anticipated keynote charity speech in exactly 5 agonizing minutes. Another message instantly popped onto the glowing screen. "I do not want your dirty money. I want pure, unquestioning obedience. When you stand up at the main podium to speak about the beautiful spirit of charity, you will take a full glass of dark red wine and pour it directly over your own head. If you hesitate for even 1 second, the printed financial ledger goes straight to the local Federal Bureau of Investigation field office before the dessert course is even served." Eleanor stared at the glowing screen in absolute, mind-numbing horror. This was absolutely not a simple financial extortion attempt. This was a calculated, deeply personal psychological torture designed to break her spirit. The terrifying demand forced Eleanor into an impossible, deeply humiliating corner. She had spent 2 entire decades carefully building her flawless, untouchable high society reputation in this affluent community, publicly ruining her exclusive designer gown and acting like a complete, unstable lunatic in front of the powerful mayor and wealthy corporate donors would permanently destroy her pristine social standing. She would become a pathetic laughingstock. But the grim, undeniable alternative was a humiliating public arrest, total financial ruin, and spending the rest of her miserable life wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit. The ruthless, untouchable predator had officially become the helpless, terrified prey. The loud, sharp tapping of a silver spoon against a crystal water glass violently echoed through the massive, crowded ballroom. The smiling event coordinator dramatically announced Eleanor as the honored guest speaker for the prestigious evening. The wealthy woman stood up on incredibly shaky legs, her expensive high heels feeling like heavy lead weights. She slowly walked up the carpeted stairs to the bright wooden podium, her racing heart hammering violently against her bruised ribs. Hundreds of wealthy, influential guests politely applauded, their eager, expectant eyes locked entirely on her pale face. She gripped the hard edges of the wooden stand, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Eleanor blindly reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the heavy crystal goblet of dark, expensive red wine waiting patiently on the podium. She looked desperately around the crowded, silent room, frantically searching for anyone holding a glowing phone and smiling maliciously. The bright, hot stage lights completely blinded her. With a choked, humiliating sob that the highly sensitive microphone easily caught and amplified across the huge room, Eleanor lifted the heavy glass high above her perfectly styled blonde hair. She violently tilted her shaking wrist, letting the dark, sticky liquid pour directly over her head, completely ruining her expensive highlights and cascading in dark, ugly stains down her beautiful crimson silk gown. Across town in the freezing, dimly lit apartment, Sarah sat quietly at her scratched wooden kitchen table. She watched the shocking, pathetic display unfold in perfect, undeniable high definition on her cracked tablet screen. The loud, synchronized gasps of the completely horrified country club audience violently echoed through the small device's cheap, tinny speakers. Sarah's scarred, exhausted face remained completely emotionless as the incredibly powerful millionaire stood dripping, shivering, and openly weeping on the bright, public stage. True justice is rarely delivered in a clean, brightly lit courtroom by a polite judge wearing a neat black robe. Sometimes, it must be violently carved out in the dark, messy shadows by those who have been relentlessly pushed far beyond the absolute breaking point of human endurance. When the established legal system inherently protects only the incredibly wealthy and insulates the privileged from all real consequences, the truly desperate are ultimately forced to become the very monsters they are fighting. They must utilize the raw, undeniable power of absolute public humiliation to completely dismantle the corrupt architecture of sheer arrogance. The blinding illusion of high society invincibility shatters the very second a wealthy bully realizes their immense financial power cannot buy them back their stolen dignity. Sarah slowly typed one final, devastating message for the cold winter night. Good girl. Now the real game begins. The heavy, imported porcelain vase shattered violently against the cold marble wall of the massive winter estate. Eleanor Vance was completely losing her fragile mind. The morning sun glared harshly through the towering floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the total destruction of her luxurious master bedroom. Torn designer dresses covered the expensive Persian rugs. She had spent the entire agonizing night aggressively tearing apart her own house, desperately searching for hidden microphones or tiny wireless cameras. The humiliating video of her pouring the dark red wine over her own head had already exploded across every single local Facebook group and neighborhood forum. Her pristine, untouchable reputation was currently bleeding to death in the vicious court of public opinion. Every single wealthy mother in the exclusive neighborhood was currently forwarding the pathetic footage and secretly laughing behind her back. Eleanor collapsed onto the edge of her unmade king-sized bed, her perfectly manicured nails biting deeply into her trembling palms. The silence in the massive mansion was absolutely deafening. Her wealthy husband had permanently moved into his corporate penthouse suite downtown months ago, leaving her entirely alone in this cold, empty fortress. The cheap burner phone sitting on her sleek glass nightstand suddenly vibrated, sounding like a deadly rattlesnake in the quiet room. She flinched violently, her stomach twisting into painful, sickening knots. She slowly reached out and picked up the glowing device. The anonymous blackmailer was already awake and firmly in control. Your closest friend Beatrice Montgomery laughed at you the entire time you were crying on stage, the cold text message read. Check your encrypted email for the high-definition screenshots from the live stream. She wants your prestigious board seat. You must eliminate her before she entirely destroys you. Eleanor scrambled to open her heavy silver laptop. The anonymous predator was absolutely right. The crisp zoomed-in photos clearly showed Beatrice hiding a malicious, mocking smile behind her manicured hand while Eleanor stood dripping in cheap wine. Across town, Sarah sat quietly at a sticky table inside a busy local Starbucks, slowly sipping a bitter black coffee. Her worn canvas sneakers rested heavily against the dirty tile floor. She watched the chaotic morning traffic outside, her dark eyes completely empty of any lingering warmth or basic human empathy. Ruining Beatrice Montgomery was a completely ruthless, highly controversial maneuver. The other wealthy woman had absolutely nothing to do with the stolen fever medicine or the cruel threats against little Lily. Beatrice was merely innocent collateral damage in a much larger, darker war. But Sarah had quickly realized that to successfully slaughter a giant beast, you must first violently chop off its supporting legs. True revenge requires a terrifying willingness to become the absolute villain in someone else's story. The second devastating text message appeared on Eleanor's glowing screen exactly 3 minutes later. You will publicly expel Beatrice from the Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy Board of Directors this morning. You will loudly accuse her of stealing petty cash from the charity fund. If you fail, the offshore bank records go straight to the capital city investigative reporters. Eleanor felt a cold sweat break out across her pale forehead. Beatrice was married to the powerful regional vice president of Chase Bank. Severing that crucial alliance would completely isolate Eleanor from the town's financial elite. It was professional social suicide, but the terrifying alternative was federal prison. Eleanor aggressively scrubbed her face, vainly trying to hide the faint pink wine stains still stubbornly lingering at her expensive blonde roots. She strapped on her heavy diamond armor, grabbed her leather designer bag, and drove her massive black Lincoln Navigator straight to the elite private academy. She parked illegally in the designated disabled spot, a desperate, pathetic attempt to cling to her rapidly fading authority. The crisp winter air felt like tiny knives against her exhausted face as she marched aggressively into the polished mahogany boardroom. The other wealthy board members immediately stopped whispering the exact second she walked through the heavy wooden doors. The suffocating tension in the large room was incredibly thick and heavy. Beatrice stood up, her face arranged in a perfect mask of fake, cloying sympathy. She gently reached out to touch Eleanor's tense shoulder, softly whispering false condolences about the humiliating incident at the country club. Eleanor stared into the deceitful eyes of her closest friend, the suffocating fear of the anonymous blackmailer completely overriding years of shallow loyalty. With a voice as cold and sharp as shattered glass, Eleanor violently slapped Beatrice's hand away and loudly demanded her immediate, unconditional resignation from the prestigious educational board. "You are a pathetic, thieving liar," Eleanor shouted, her shrill voice echoing violently off the expensive wood paneling. "I have undeniable proof that you have been secretly skimming thousands of dollars from the children's annual charity auction. Get out of my school before I call the local police." The entire affluent board gasped in absolute paralyzed horror. Beatrice stumbled backward, her expensive leather heels slipping slightly on the polished floor. Her perfectly powdered face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She did not bother to defend herself against the wild, baseless accusations. She simply promised total, absolute vengeance before storming out of the heavy double doors. Eleanor stood shaking by the large conference table, completely alone in a room full of terrified, silent people. She had successfully followed the brutal instructions, but she had just permanently destroyed her only remaining social lifeline. She pulled the cheap burner phone from her deep coat pocket and sent a desperate, trembling message into the dark void. "It is done. She is gone. Are we finally finished?" She stared at the glowing digital screen, silently begging the invisible monster for a tiny shred of mercy. Back at the crowded coffee shop, Sarah read the pathetic, begging message while calmly throwing her empty paper cup into the trash can. She pulled her thin wool coat tightly around her shoulders and stepped back out into the freezing Ohio wind. The rich women were finally tearing each other apart, doing her bloody work for her. But the dark game was absolutely not over until Eleanor Vance had lost everything she valued. Sarah slowly typed her next terrifying demand. "We are never finished. Tomorrow morning, you will officially double the academic scholarship for Lily, and you will personally deliver a formal, public apology to her mother at the local diner. The final trap was permanently set. The heavy brass bell above the diner door chimed exactly at noon, signaling the arrival of a broken millionaire. Eleanor Vance nervously pushed through the greasy glass doors of the busy Crestwood diner, looking entirely out of place among the tired truck drivers and exhausted factory workers. She wore massive dark sunglasses and a plain beige trench coat tightly belted around her thin waist. The wealthy woman was desperately trying to remain completely unnoticed, a stark contrast to the loud, arrogant queen who usually demanded the best corner booth. Her hands were shoved deep into her coat pockets, and her shoulders were slumped in pure, unadulterated defeat. Sarah stood quietly behind the worn Formica counter, slowly wiping the exact same spotless area with a damp cotton rag. She watched the terrified woman scan the crowded room with wide, paranoid eyes. The suffocating arrogance was completely gone, entirely replaced by the frantic, nervous twitch of a cornered animal. Sarah felt a dark, satisfying thrill bloom deep inside her chest. She grabbed a fresh glass pot of scalding black coffee and slowly walked over to the cracked vinyl booth where Eleanor had silently collapsed. Eleanor awkwardly adjusted her expensive leather designer bag, the strong scent of her floral perfume clashing terribly with the heavy smell of frying bacon and burnt toast. She refused to even glance at the sticky laminated menu sitting on the table. Sarah simply stood there, her face a perfect, impenetrable mask of bored, working-class indifference. The silence stretched between them, heavy and incredibly uncomfortable, until Eleanor finally pulled off her oversized sunglasses with violently shaking fingers. "I need to speak with you privately about your daughter," Eleanor whispered softly, her voice trembling noticeably under the loud, rhythmic hum of the ancient ceiling fan. "I am officially doubling Lily's academic scholarship to fully cover all expensive uniforms, private tutoring, and daily transportation for the next 10 years. And I am deeply, truly sorry for my completely unacceptable behavior at the local grocery store last week." Sarah deliberately took her time pouring the steaming dark coffee into a thick ceramic mug, quietly relishing the glorious, absolute shift in power. Just a few short days ago, this exact same woman had callously threatened to permanently destroy an innocent child's future simply because she wanted a bottle of cherry syrup for her stupid dog. Now, the untouchable millionaire was physically bowing her head in a cheap diner, offering massive financial concessions to a woman in a stained work apron. The most beautiful part of the entire situation was the blinding irony. Eleanor was completely and utterly unaware that the poor, exhausted waitress silently pouring her morning coffee was the exact same invisible monster holding a brutal knife to her financial throat. Eleanor suddenly reached deep into her leather bag and pulled out a thick, completely unmarked white envelope. She aggressively pushed it across the sticky wooden table, her manicured fingers pressing heavily against the thick stack of $100 bills clearly visible inside. "There is exactly $20,000 in untraceable cash right there in that envelope," the wealthy woman desperately confessed, her dark eyes darting nervously around the crowded, noisy room. "Someone very dangerous is currently targeting my family and my career. They somehow know absolutely everything about where I go and who I speak to. I firmly believe it is one of my wealthy, jealous friends who frequently visits this exact diner for lunch." Eleanor leaned forward, her face twisted in a pathetic display of raw, unfiltered terror. "I want to secretly hire you to quietly watch them, listen closely to their private conversations, and report absolutely everything back to me. Nobody ever pays any attention to the invisible waitress refilling their water glasses. You would be my perfect, undetectable spy." Sarah stared blankly at the massive pile of illegal cash sitting right next to the cheap pink artificial sweetener packets. Accepting this dirty money was a massive, highly controversial leap into the dark abyss. It officially made her an active, willing participant in Eleanor's massive criminal network. It was deeply unethical, legally dangerous, and crossed a permanent moral boundary. But $20,000 would instantly secure a safe, comfortable, and incredibly stable life for little Lily, entirely free from the constant terror of unpaid winter heating bills and empty kitchen cabinets. Sarah slowly reached out with a steady hand and smoothly slid the thick white envelope into the deep front pocket of her faded cotton apron. She did not offer a comforting smile, and she absolutely did not make any false, eager promises of loyal friendship. "I hear absolutely everything that happens in this loud diner," Sarah replied smoothly, her voice completely flat, dark, and utterly devoid of any lingering emotion. You will soon know absolutely everything that I know." Eleanor visibly relaxed, letting out a long, heavy sigh of immense relief. She foolishly believed her immense, corrupt wealth had just successfully purchased a loyal, desperate spy among the struggling working class. She quickly stood up, leaving the hot black coffee entirely untouched, and practically ran back out into the freezing Ohio afternoon. She actually felt completely safe, entirely blind to the terrible, devastating reality of her current situation. Sarah walked straight back to the loud steaming kitchen, heavily feeling the thick envelope of dirty cash burning like a hot coal against her hip. She had just successfully stolen the frantic enemy's own secret war fund to actively finance the brutal remainder of her absolute revenge. She pulled out the cheap, untraceable prepaid phone from her boot and quickly typed the next crushing command to the woman who had just left. "Your pathetic attempt to buy a new diner waitress spy cannot save you from me. Tomorrow morning, you will publicly confess your financial crimes to the town mayor." The cheap burner phone violently vibrating against the dark mahogany dashboard of the massive Lincoln Navigator completely shattered Eleanor Vance's brief illusion of safety. She aggressively slammed on her heavy brakes in the middle of a snowy intersection. The harsh text message regarding her pathetic attempt to buy a diner waitress completely destroyed her fragile sanity. The invisible blackmailer was not just watching her from a comfortable distance. The terrifying predator was sitting right inside that greasy, smelling diner. Eleanor tightly gripped the leather steering wheel until her knuckles turned perfectly white. Confessing her massive financial crimes to the local town mayor meant serving 20 years in a federal penitentiary. She absolutely refused to surrender her luxurious life without a brutal, bloody fight. Eleanor aggressively dialed a highly secured number saved deep inside her expensive designer smartphone. She bypassed the local police department entirely, knowing their strict legal rules would severely limit her dark options. Instead, she contacted Marcus Thorne, a heavily disgraced former state trooper who now ran a highly illegal, strictly off-the-books private security firm operating entirely out of Cleveland. Marcus specialized in aggressively solving expensive problems for desperate millionaires, utilizing raw physical violence rather than legally obtained court warrants. Eleanor frantically offered the dangerous man $50,000 to permanently eliminate the anonymous blackmailer by the end of the freezing weekend. Marcus accepted the lucrative contract without asking a single moral question. Meanwhile, inside the cold, dimly lit duplex, Sarah was carefully stacking the thick $100 bills she had successfully stolen from her wealthy enemy. The massive pile of illegal cash looked completely foreign against her cheap, scratched kitchen table. The burner phone suddenly chimed, displaying a surprisingly defiant message from Eleanor. The wealthy woman completely rejected the demand to publicly confess. Instead, she offered a massive final payout of $2 million in clean, untraceable cash in exchange for the original stolen ledger and permanent silence. She demanded a physical exchange later that exact same night at the abandoned industrial rail yard on the dangerous outskirts of town. Sarah stared coldly at the glowing digital screen. The extremely generous financial offer was completely fake, an obvious, poorly disguised physical trap designed specifically to permanently silence her. A truly frightened millionaire desperately trying to buy their freedom does not suddenly demand a midnight meeting at an isolated, abandoned train yard. Eleanor was sending professional, violent thugs to violently retrieve her stolen financial documents and quietly dispose of the problematic blackmailer. The terrifying realization that her wealthy enemy was fully prepared to commit premeditated murder sent a dark, freezing chill straight down Sarah's spine. This was the critical moment where Sarah had to completely abandon the last remaining fragments of her own humanity. She needed to definitively prove Eleanor's murderous intentions to the federal authorities, but she absolutely could not risk leaving little Lily completely orphaned in the dangerous process. Sarah quickly accessed an anonymous gig economy application on her cheap tablet, posting a highly lucrative, immediate delivery job. She offered $500 in cash for a simple, quick nighttime courier task. A desperate, struggling local college student driving a rusty Honda Civic eagerly accepted the dangerous job within 3 short minutes, completely unaware of the lethal trap waiting in the dark shadows. Sarah tightly bundled a thick stack of worthless blank newspaper clippings into a heavy brown envelope, making it look exactly like the stolen financial ledger. She carefully met the young, exhausted delivery driver behind a dark, deserted local gas station, handing him the fake package and the promised cash payment. She strictly instructed the confused student to simply walk into the abandoned rail yard, drop the heavy package near the rusty central tracks, and immediately drive away. Using an innocent, completely unsuspecting civilian as human bait was a deeply horrific, completely unforgivable moral violation. If Marcus Thorne and his violent security team simply shot the poor driver on sight, the young man's tragic death would permanently stain Sarah's soul. The freezing midnight wind howled aggressively through the dark, rusting metal skeletons of the abandoned industrial rail yard. Sarah parked her old, battered sedan several blocks away, carefully hiking through the deep winter snow to a high, hidden vantage point on a crumbling brick overpass. Through the dark, snowy night, she watched the rusty Honda Civic slowly pull into the desolate yard. The young college student nervously stepped out of the warm vehicle, tightly clutching the heavy brown envelope. The yard seemed completely empty and dead, wrapped in a thick, suffocating blanket of silent winter snow. The brutal, terrifying violence erupted without a single second of warning. 3 massive, heavily armed men dressed in completely black tactical gear suddenly rushed out from behind a rusted, decaying shipping container. They did not shout any polite legal warnings or ask any basic questions. One man aggressively tackled the screaming student to the frozen, unforgiving ground, brutally pressing a heavy, steel-toed combat boot directly into the back of his fragile neck. The young driver sobbed uncontrollably, begging desperately for his life in the dark snow. Another violent thug quickly snatched the brown envelope, aggressively ripping it open under the pale, creeping moonlight. When the dangerous men finally realized the thick package contained absolutely nothing but worthless cut newspaper, the massive leader swore loudly, pulled out a heavy, silenced pistol, and aimed it directly at the terrified student's head. Sarah clamped her cold, trembling hand incredibly hard over her own mouth to completely stifle a horrified, choking gasp. The blinding illusion of a relatively bloodless, carefully controlled psychological war was officially, permanently over. Eleanor Vance was not just a greedy, entitled thief stealing precious resources from academic charity funds. She was a ruthless, cold-blooded monster fully prepared to execute absolutely anyone who threatened her comfortable, highly privileged lifestyle. The terrifying stakes had just violently escalated from simple federal financial fraud directly to brutal, premeditated first-degree murder. Sarah slowly backed away from the crumbling brick ledge, her racing heart hammering violently against her sore ribs. She had successfully captured the terrifying assault on her cheap tablet camera, securing undeniable visual proof of the attempted assassination. The wealthy woman desperately wanted a brutal, deadly war in the dark shadows, and Sarah was finally ready to burn the entire corrupted town straight to the absolute ground. The heavy, suppressed pistol was pointed directly at the trembling back of the young delivery driver's head. Sarah had absolutely no time to reconsider her terrifying choices. Her frozen fingers rapidly punched the emergency dispatch number into the cheap prepaid phone. When the tired operator finally answered, Sarah deliberately lowered her voice to a frantic, terrified whisper. She aggressively lied, screaming that heavily armed terrorists were currently executing a uniformed police officer inside the abandoned industrial rail yard. That specific, highly calculated lie was the absolute fastest way to trigger a massive, overwhelming tactical police response in the sleepy Ohio town. She immediately dropped the burner phone straight down into the deep, powdery snow and aggressively kicked ice over it to permanently bury the digital evidence. Less than 60 agonizing seconds later, the distant, shrieking wail of multiple police sirens violently pierced the silent winter night. The terrifying noise rapidly multiplied, growing incredibly loud as half a dozen state patrol cruisers aggressively sped toward the isolated train yard. The massive leader of the violent security team cursed loudly under his freezing breath. He aggressively kicked the sobbing college student hard in the ribs, roughly ordered his armed men to retreat immediately, and sprinted back toward the rusted shipping containers. The heavy black sport utility vehicle roared to life, violently tearing through the deep snow and vanishing into the dark shadows just before the first flashing blue police lights illuminated the broken perimeter fence. Sarah let out a long, violently shaking breath. The young college student was brutally bruised and deeply traumatized, but he was incredibly lucky to still be breathing. She slowly backed away from the crumbling brick overpass, quietly slipping away into the freezing darkness while the heavily armed police officers swarmed the chaotic scene below. The terrifying physical confrontation was finally over, but the absolute, total destruction of Eleanor Vance's perfect world was just officially beginning. Sarah drove her battered sedan back to her quiet duplex, her racing heart slowly calming into a cold, deadly rhythm. She sat down at her scratched kitchen table, opened her cheap tablet, and professionally prepared the ultimate execution package. She carefully combined the stolen offshore bank ledgers, the high-definition video of the brutal assassination attempt, and the highly incriminating text messages where Eleanor had explicitly ordered the violent hit. This was absolutely no longer just about public humiliation or simple local revenge. This was a calculated, devastating atomic bomb designed specifically to permanently obliterate the wealthy woman's entire corrupt existence. However, Sarah did not simply send the devastating evidence straight to the local police department. The established justice system was notoriously slow, frequently allowing incredibly wealthy criminals to easily buy their way out of severe consequences using expensive corporate lawyers. Sarah wanted immediate, irreversible financial destruction. She created a completely anonymous email account and attached the massive digital file. She aggressively typed in the private corporate email address of Richard Vance, Eleanor's incredibly wealthy and notoriously ruthless investment banker husband. Richard deeply despised public scandals, viewing any negative media attention as a direct, unacceptable threat to his massive financial empire. To guarantee absolute, inescapable accountability, Sarah blindly copied the aggressive state attorney general and the chief investigative reporter for the largest regional television network in Ohio. She stared at the glowing blue screen for one final, silent moment. She vividly remembered little Lily shivering violently under the cheap wool blankets without her necessary fever medicine. She remembered the terrified college student sobbing in the freezing snow with a heavy gun pointed at his fragile head. Sarah pressed the send button with absolute, uncompromising finality. The deadly digital missile was officially launched into the wealthy elite's comfortable world. The early morning sun violently pierced through the towering glass windows of the massive winter estate. Eleanor was frantically pacing across her expensive Persian rugs, aggressively chewing on her perfectly manicured fingernails. She had not slept a single second. She was desperately waiting for a secure message from Marcus Thorne confirming the bloody job was finally finished. Instead, the heavy oak front doors of the mansion were violently thrown open. Her husband, Richard, aggressively stormed into the grand marble foyer. He did not look like a concerned, loving partner. He looked like a cold, calculating corporate butcher preparing to aggressively trim off a diseased, toxic limb. Richard violently threw a thick, heavy stack of printed legal documents directly onto the fragile glass coffee table. He pulled a pair of silver scissors from his expensive tailored suit pocket and ruthlessly cut Eleanor's platinum credit cards perfectly in half. Eleanor gasped in absolute horror, her trembling hands flying to her pale face as she stared at the ruined plastic. Richard coldly informed his terrified wife that federal financial investigators were currently aggressively raiding the main administrative offices of the Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy. The local television news stations were already broadcasting the brutal assassination video on a continuous, humiliating loop. "You are a toxic, unpredictable liability to my firm, Eleanor," Richard stated, his deep voice completely stripped of any human warmth or lingering affection. "I have officially frozen every single joint financial account we own to completely protect my corporate assets from federal seizure. My expensive legal team has already filed the formal divorce papers. I am leaving this massive house right now, and you will absolutely face these brutal federal indictments entirely alone." Eleanor violently dropped to her bruised knees, desperately grabbing at the crisp, tailored fabric of her husband's expensive suit pants. She sobbed uncontrollably, loudly begging him to use his immense political connections to save her from the terrifying federal agents. Richard simply looked down at her with absolute, pure disgust. He forcefully pulled his leg away, turned his back on the weeping woman, and aggressively marched straight out the heavy front doors without a single backward glance. The loud roar of his luxury sedan engine quickly faded down the long, private driveway. Eleanor was completely alone, utterly stripped of her immense wealth, her powerful allies, and her pristine social reputation. The massive, empty mansion felt like a beautiful, expensive tomb. Her designer smartphone buzzed sharply against the cold marble floor. Her shaking, manicured fingers slowly reached out to retrieve the glowing device. The final message from the anonymous diner waitress was incredibly short, brutally cold, and utterly devastating. Your husband just left. Your bank accounts are frozen. The state police are exactly 3 minutes away from your front door. Run. Eleanor Vance collapsed completely onto the cold floor, unleashing a loud, agonizing scream of pure, absolute despair into the dark, empty house. The heavy wail of approaching police sirens echoed violently through the massive, empty rooms of the luxurious winter estate. Eleanor Vance scrambled up from the cold marble floor, her incredibly expensive designer high heels slipping awkwardly as absolute, unadulterated panic completely possessed her fragile mind. She frantically grabbed her heavy leather handbag, completely ignoring the useless, cut pieces of her platinum credit cards scattered across the glass coffee table. She rushed desperately out the heavy back doors, plunging aggressively into the freezing Ohio morning without even grabbing her thick cashmere coat. The blinding illusion of high society safety had completely evaporated, violently replaced by the raw, terrifying instinct of a hunted animal. She forcefully pushed through the tall, thorny hedges bordering her massive property, her custom crimson silk blouse snagging violently on the sharp, frozen branches. The beautiful, pristine fabric aggressively tore open, exposing her pale, shivering skin to the biting winter wind. Eleanor sprinted blindly down the snowy residential street, desperately hoping to flag down one of her wealthy, influential neighbors for immediate shelter. She loudly pounded her manicured fists against the heavy wooden door of the Montgomery mansion. Beatrice Montgomery, the former close friend Eleanor had ruthlessly publicly destroyed just yesterday, slowly opened the tall door. Beatrice simply stared at the pathetic, freezing, crying woman, offered a cold, satisfied smile, and aggressively slammed the heavy door directly in Eleanor's desperate face. The terrifying realization finally crashed down upon her shivering shoulders. She was completely, utterly isolated. The same ruthless, arrogant tactics she had aggressively utilized to dominate the local social hierarchy had successfully stripped her of absolutely any genuine human compassion. Eleanor stumbled clumsily toward the busy commercial district, her expensive leather shoes completely soaked with freezing, dirty slush. She desperately needed to escape the rapidly closing police dragnet, but her frozen bank accounts completely denied her access to even the most basic transportation. She violently pushed open the heavy glass doors of the busy local bus terminal, the warm, stale air smelling strongly of cheap diesel fuel and unwashed bodies. It was the exact type of filthy, crowded public space she usually openly mocked during her wealthy society luncheons. Eleanor frantically approached the ticket counter, aggressively digging through her heavy leather bag for any remaining cash. She managed to scrape together a few crumpled dollar bills and expensive silver coins, frantically shoving them toward the bored, exhausted ticket agent. The indifferent man slowly counted the pathetic pile of money and coldly informed her that she was exactly $3 short for the cheapest one-way ticket to the neighboring county. "Do you have absolutely any idea who I am?" Eleanor screamed frantically, her shrill voice breaking terribly as she aggressively slammed her manicured hands against the thick bulletproof glass. "I am the president of the Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy Board of Directors. I demand that you give me that ticket immediately, or I will personally ensure you are fired before lunch." The board ticket agent simply stared at her ruined, torn silk blouse and her messy, wind-blown hair. He reached forward and smoothly slid her pathetic pile of coins back under the small gap in the heavy glass. He coldly gestured toward the small, dirty television mounted high in the corner of the waiting room. The local morning news was currently broadcasting a highly unflattering, zoomed-in photograph of Eleanor's face, loudly detailing the massive federal financial fraud and the brutal attempted assassination at the abandoned rail yard. The angry, judging eyes of every single tired commuter in the crowded waiting room slowly turned to stare directly at the ruined millionaire. Eleanor slowly backed away from the ticket counter, absolute terror completely gripping her racing heart. She stumbled back out into the freezing, unforgiving street, desperately seeking anywhere to hide from the rapidly expanding police search. Her expensive leather shoes had violently rubbed her delicate feet entirely raw, leaving tiny, pathetic drops of bright red blood in the dirty white snow. She limped painfully down a dark, narrow alleyway behind a row of cheap fast food restaurants, aggressively searching for the smallest shred of safety. She finally collapsed heavily behind a massive, rusting green dumpster, the overwhelming smell of rotting garbage violently assaulting her sensitive nose. She pulled her freezing knees tightly against her chest, shivering violently in the bitter winter wind. Her expensive designer smartphone was completely dead, a useless block of cold metal in her numb hands. She had absolutely nothing left. She possessed no massive bank accounts to aggressively bully the local authorities, no powerful husband to silently clean up her dark messes, and absolutely no loyal friends to offer her a warm place to hide. As she sat shivering uncontrollably in the filthy, freezing alleyway, a loud, heavy pair of black boots slowly crunched through the deep snow, stopping completely still just a few short feet away. Eleanor slowly looked up, her vision terribly blurred by freezing, desperate tears. Two stern, heavily armed state police officers stood towering directly over her. They did not shout any aggressive commands or loudly draw their heavy weapons. They simply looked down at the pathetic, broken woman hiding like a terrified rat in the rotting garbage, their faces completely devoid of any basic human sympathy. Eleanor Vance, you are officially under federal arrest for massive financial fraud, extreme corporate embezzlement, and the attempted, premeditated murder of an innocent civilian, the taller officer stated, his deep voice carrying absolutely no emotion in the freezing air. He smoothly pulled a pair of heavy, freezing steel handcuffs from his thick leather belt. The loud, metallic click of the heavy restraints violently locking around her delicate, manicured wrists was the absolute final, devastating sound of her old, luxurious life permanently ending. She was no longer a powerful, untouchable queen ruling over the desperate working class. She was just another common, desperate criminal shivering in the dirty winter snow, finally forced to pay the brutal, undeniable price for her sheer, unadulterated arrogance. The warm, golden sunlight of a crisp early spring morning gently filtered through the thin curtains of the small duplex kitchen. Sarah stood peacefully by the humming stove, carefully flipping thick buttermilk pancakes in a heavy skillet. The harsh, biting winter that had aggressively threatened to freeze their fragile lives had finally broken, surrendering entirely to the gentle warmth of the changing season. For the very first time in as long as she could vividly remember, her exhausted shoulders were completely relaxed. The suffocating, constant terror of unpaid utility bills and empty kitchen cabinets had vanished, permanently replaced by a quiet, steady sense of absolute security. The massive stack of untraceable cash was safely hidden away, silently securing a completely stable future. Little Lily sat happily at the scratched wooden table, her pale cheeks flushed with vibrant, healthy color. The terrifying fever that had nearly cost her everything was now nothing more than a fading, distant memory. She was eagerly drawing a bright, colorful picture of her beautiful new school. Her pristine, freshly pressed Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy uniform hung neatly on the back of the wooden chair, completely fully paid for by the massive scholarship her former tormentor had desperately finalized. Sarah smiled softly, placing a warm plate of fluffy pancakes covered in pure maple syrup directly in front of her giggling daughter. A small, cheap television rested quietly on the corner of the worn kitchen counter, broadcasting the local morning news at a comfortable volume. The serious, professionally dressed news anchor was loudly detailing the completely unprecedented collapse of the Vance financial empire. Eleanor Vance had just been officially denied federal bail by a completely unsympathetic federal judge. The wealthy woman was currently sitting in a cold, concrete holding cell at the county jail, aggressively awaiting a highly publicized criminal trial that would undoubtedly send her to a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. The devastating documents had successfully triggered a massive avalanche of federal investigations. The aggressive federal probe had not stopped with just the arrogant school board president. The incredibly ruthless investment banker Richard Vance was also officially under strict federal indictment for massive corporate money laundering and extensive tax evasion. The cold husband who had so ruthlessly abandoned his terrified wife to save his own massive fortune was now violently facing the exact same terrifying legal destruction. The entirely corrupt Academy Board of Directors had been completely dissolved and immediately replaced by a strict oversight committee. The massive charity endowment fund was finally being properly audited, ensuring that millions of stolen dollars would be completely returned to the struggling children. Sarah calmly poured herself a steaming mug of fresh black coffee, slowly stirring in a generous splash of sweet vanilla cream. She had completely burned her faded, stained diner waitress apron in the small metal trash can behind her apartment 2 nights ago. She no longer had to silently endure the cruel, humiliating abuse of wealthy, entitled customers or corrupt, thieving managers. She had successfully used a small portion of the secret war fund to officially enroll in online accounting classes at the local community college. The terrifying monster she had become was now permanently retired, completely locked away. She slowly walked over to the heavy wooden front door and picked up the morning newspaper resting on the small welcome mat. The front page featured a highly unflattering, deeply humiliating photograph of Eleanor being aggressively escorted in heavy steel handcuffs by two stern federal marshals. The wealthy woman looked incredibly small, terribly frail, and completely broken. Sarah stared at the printed image for one long, silent moment. She did not feel any sudden surge of triumphant joy, nor did she feel a single shred of lingering guilt. She simply felt a profound, heavy emptiness, a quiet acknowledgement that a brutal war was won. Lily happily finished her sweet breakfast, quickly grabbing her heavy new canvas backpack. Sarah knelt down on the worn linoleum floor, gently zipping up her daughter's warm spring jacket and placing a soft, loving kiss on her bright forehead. They walked out of the small duplex together, stepping out into the bright, incredibly hopeful morning air. The yellow school bus was already waiting patiently at the end of the quiet residential street. Sarah watched her beautiful daughter confidently climb the heavy metal steps, her small face glowing with pure excitement for her very first day at the prestigious private academy. As the massive yellow bus slowly drove away down the sunny street, Sarah took a deep, steadying breath of the fresh spring air. The cheap, untraceable burner phone that had successfully brought a powerful millionaire to her absolute knees was currently resting peacefully at the dark, freezing bottom of the deep town reservoir. There were absolutely no remaining digital traces, no lingering physical evidence, and no loose ends left to ever connect the quiet, unassuming mother to the spectacular, explosive ruin of the local high society. We are often beautifully taught that the grand universe naturally balances itself, that genuine karma will eventually arrive to properly punish the wicked and gracefully reward the innocent. But the stark, uncomfortable reality is that true justice is rarely a natural, spontaneous occurrence. It is usually a heavy, incredibly dangerous tool that must be violently forged in the absolute darkest fires of human desperation. True morality is not simply the passive, quiet refusal to do wrong. It is the terrifying, active willingness to completely dismantle a corrupt, broken system to fiercely protect those who cannot protect themselves. When ruthless arrogance violently pushes a quiet, unassuming soul past the absolute breaking point, the resulting destruction is never a tragic accident. It is a necessary, purifying fire. Kindness should never be foolishly mistaken for innate weakness, because the most terrifying monsters are always born from the deepest, most profound love.